November 15, 1965, 0800 hours. Landing zone X-ray, Ia Drang Valley, Central Highlands of South Vietnam. Lieutenant Charlie Hastings gripped the radio handset with both hands. Around him, the world was disintegrating. The forward air controller could barely hear his own voice. Over the roar of automatic weapons fire, the screaming of wounded men, and the relentless crack of AK-47 rounds snapping through the elephant grass. Just 30 yards away, Charlie Company was being torn apart. The temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees. It would hit 100 before noon. Hastings pressed the radio to his ear and shouted two words that would echo through military history: broken arrow. What those words meant, the North Vietnamese soldiers charging through the tall grass didn't yet understand. What they triggered a response so overwhelming it would redefine modern warfare was already beginning. Because at that very moment, above the chaos of landing zone X-ray, American aircraft were stacking up like a deadly carousel. At 1,000 feet, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, all the way up to 35,000 feet. Every 1,000 feet, another aircraft, circling, waiting, fighter bombers, attack jets, helicopters, B-52s en route from Guam. All of them, every single one now had the same mission: save the Americans at X-ray. This is the story of how a single radio call transformed near certain defeat into one of the most devastating defensive stands in American military history. This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, his outnumbered battalion, and the day they called down thunder from the sky. This is the story of Broken Arrow, June 16th, 1965, Fort Benning, Georgia. The 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile didn't exist 6 months before the Battle of Ia Drang. It was an experiment, a gamble, a radical reimagining of how armies could move and fight. The concept was simple, almost absurdly so. Helicopters would replace horses. Battalions wouldn't march to battle, they would fly. Artillery support wouldn't be towed by trucks, it would rain from the sky. Soldiers wouldn't dig in and hold ground, they would strike like lightning and vanish like smoke. The reality was far more complex. Major General Harry Kennard, the division's commander, faced skepticism from every direction. Traditional infantry commanders questioned whether soldiers arriving by helicopter would be combat effective. Could men who just spent 30 minutes being violently shaken in a hole really fight the moment their boots hit the ground? Artillery officers doubted that air support could ever replace sustained ground-based fire. And nearly everyone wondered the same thing. What happens when the helicopters leave? The Bell UH-1 Iroquois the Huey could carry between 10 and 12 fully equipped soldiers. It was loud, it was vulnerable, it leaked hydraulic fluid, and it was about to become the most recognizable symbol of the Vietnam War. More than 6,000 Hueys would eventually serve in Vietnam. Nearly 3,000 would be lost. But in June 1965, as the 1st Air Cavalry Division was activated by merging elements of the 11th Air Assault Division and the 2nd Infantry Division, none of that was known. What was known was this: the Central Highlands of South Vietnam had almost no roads, brutal terrain, and was crawling with Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army regulars. If air cavalry was going to work anywhere, it had to work there. Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 160 pounds. He didn't look like a warrior from Central Casting. He looked like a high school math teacher. He was also one of the most meticulously prepared commanders in the United States Army. Moore had taken command of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, the same unit that George Armstrong Custer had led to disaster at Little Bighorn in 1876. Moore knew the history. He knew the symbolism. And he was determined that history would not repeat itself. The 7th Cavalry was comprised of 3 rifle companies, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, plus a combat support company called Delta. At full strength, each rifle company had 6 officers and 164 enlisted men. Each company was divided into 3 platoons, plus a weapons platoon with 3 81mm mortar squads. Each platoon had 3 rifle squads and 2 M60 machine guns. On paper, it was a formidable force. Moore didn't trust paper. He drilled his men relentlessly. He studied French military reports from their disastrous war in Vietnam. He interviewed every veteran he could find who had fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia. He read about ambush tactics, he studied North Vietnamese doctrine, he practiced helicopter insertions until his pilots and soldiers could execute them in their sleep. Most importantly, Moore developed contingency plans. Plans for if his companies were separated, plans for if they were surrounded, plans for if they were outnumbered. He had a plan for everything except one scenario, being outnumbered 10 to 1. The Ia Drang Valley sits in the central highlands of South Vietnam near the Cambodian border. The name translates roughly to River of the Drang Tribe. It's a landscape of contrast flat clearings surrounded by thick jungle, all dominated by the Tru Po Massif, a mountain that rises like a dark sentinel over the valley floor. In October 1965, American intelligence detected something alarming. Two full North Vietnamese army regiments, the 33rd and the 66th, were operating in the Ia Drang Valley under the command of General Chu Hui Man. Together, these regiments represented more than 3,000 combat-hardened soldiers. The North Vietnamese weren't hiding. They were preparing, building fighting positions, stockpiling ammunition, training for what they believed would be their first major victory over American forces. What General Man didn't know was that the Americans were preparing too. On November 14th, 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Moore received his orders. Conduct a helicopter assault into the Ia Drang Valley. Find the enemy. Fix them in place. Destroy them. Moore called his officers together. The plan was straightforward. His battalion would fly UH-1 helicopters into a clearing designated landing zone X-ray at the base of the Tru Po Mountain. The LZ was small, only large enough for 8 Huis to land at once. That meant multiple flights, multiple vulnerable moments when only a fraction of his force would be on the ground. We're going hot, Moore told his men. Expect contact immediately. He studied the map one more time. The clearing was roughly the size of a football field, shaped like a rough oval. Elephant grass covered most of it, providing concealment for an attacking force. Tree lines surrounded the clearing on 3 sides. To the west loomed the Tru Po Mountain, its slopes covered in thick jungle. It was, Moore thought, a perfect place for an ambush. What he couldn't know was that 3 North Vietnamese battalions were dug in around that clearing. Not 2 regiments somewhere in the valley, 3 battalions right there. Roughly 1,600 soldiers in prepared fighting positions, waiting. The mathematics of destruction were already in motion. November 14th, 1965, 10:30 hours, the first Hueys descended into landing zone X-ray through a landscape that seemed almost peaceful. The morning sun painted the elephant grass gold. The air was clear. For exactly 30 minutes, it stayed that way. Captain John Herron's Bravo Company touched down first, along with Moore's command element. The helicopter blades whipped the tall grass into a frenzy. Soldiers jumped out, fanned into defensive positions, and the Hueys lifted off, flying back to pick up the next wave. The second lift brought the rest of Bravo Company and a platoon from Captain Tony Nadal's Alpha Company. The third brought the rest of Alpha. The fourth brought Captain Ray Lefebvre's Delta Company. It was between the second and third landings that everything changed. Bravo Company sent out patrols to probe the tree lines. One patrol, moving northwest toward a dried creek bed, captured a North Vietnamese soldier. The prisoner was terrified. Through an interpreter, he said something that made every American within earshot go cold. 3 battalions, looking for Americans. 12:45 p.m. The first shots cracked out from the northwest tree line. Not a few random shots, not harassing fire. A sustained, coordinated fusillade that sounded like canvas being ripped in half. 3 platoons of Bravo Company, caught in the open near the creek bed, went to ground immediately. What happened next would define the battle and illuminate both the promise and peril of Moore's approach. 2nd Lieutenant Henry Herrick's 2nd Platoon counterattacked immediately, chasing the North Vietnamese soldiers who appeared to be retreating back into the tree line. Herrick's men were aggressive. They were well trained. They advanced into the jungle, killing enemy soldiers as they went. They advanced too far. The North Vietnamese weren't retreating. They were luring. Within minutes, 2nd Platoon was flanked on both sides. Within an hour, Lieutenant Herrick was dead, shot through the chest. Sergeant Ernie Savage took command of what was left of the platoon. Of the 27 men who had followed Herrick into the trees, 9 were already dead and more were wounded. Savage would later remember, "There was no way for retreat. The only thing we could do was set up a perimeter and redistribute ammunition." Second platoon was cut off, surrounded, 30 yards into the jungle, which might as well have been 30 miles. They would stay cut off for more than 24 hours, but they would never be overrun. As the sun set on November 14th, Lieutenant Colonel Moore had a fragmentary battalion distributed around a clearing that was rapidly becoming a killing ground. He had 1 platoon cut off. He had North Vietnamese forces all around him, and he was outnumbered by a margin he wouldn't learn until after the battle, roughly 4-1. What Moore did have was something the North Vietnamese didn't fully understand yet: overwhelming fire support. Artillery batteries at nearby landing zone Falcon, several kilometers away, began firing continuous fire missions. The 105mm howitzers could hit targets with devastating accuracy, and Moore's forward observers were skilled at calling fire danger close within 100 meters of friendly positions. And then there was air support. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, fighters and attack aircraft made pass after pass over X-ray, F-100 Super Sabres, F-4 Phantoms, A-1 Sky Raiders. They dropped bombs, napalm, and rockets into the tree lines. They strafed North Vietnamese positions with 20mm cannons. The North Vietnamese probed the American perimeter throughout the night with small unit attacks. Each probe was met with concentrated machine gun fire, M79 grenade launchers, and artillery support that turned sections of jungle into moonscapes. The temperature dropped from 100 degrees to a humid 80. In the darkness, Moore walked his perimeter, talking to his men, adjusting positions, coordinating with his company commanders. He slept 90 minutes that night. The isolated 2nd platoon, surrounded in the jungle, fought off multiple attacks. Sergeant Savage had his men redistribute ammunition constantly. Every man with a working rifle had 5 magazines. Every man without a working rifle picked up weapons from the dead. They held, as dawn approached on November 15th, Moore knew 2 things with absolute certainty. The North Vietnamese were going to attack in force, and when they did, it would be worse than anything his men had experienced the day before. He was right on both counts. November 15th, 1965, 07:45 hours. The North Vietnamese came from 3 directions simultaneously, not in ones and twos, not in squad-sized elements, in human waves. Hundreds of soldiers emerging from the tree lines with AK-47s blazing, throwing grenades, screaming as they charged. The attack was coordinated, massive, and terrifying. Charlie Company, positioned on the southern edge of the perimeter, took the brunt of the first assault. Within 15 minutes, all 6 of Charlie Company's officers were dead. Lieutenants, the company commander, his executive officer gone, shot down in the first chaotic minutes as North Vietnamese soldiers close to within yards of American positions. The non-commissioned officers took over. Sergeants who had never commanded more than a squad suddenly found themselves commanding what was left of entire platoons, entire companies. They held the line, but barely. The North Vietnamese were using a tactic that would define their strategy throughout the war. Grab them by the belt, close the distance between forces so rapidly, get so close to American positions that artillery and air support couldn't be used without risking friendly casualties. It was working. By 8 a.m., North Vietnamese soldiers were fighting hand-to-hand with Americans in the tall grass of landing zone X-ray. The command post was taking fire. The aid station was taking fire. Men were bleeding out in positions they couldn't retreat from, and medics couldn't reach. Lieutenant Charlie Hastings, Moore's forward air controller, was on the radio constantly, directing airstrikes, but the pilots were hesitant, the lines of contact were blurred, the risk of hitting American positions was extreme. And then Charlie Company's line began to buckle, 0800 hours. Hastings keyed his radio and transmitted the 2 words that would change everything. Broken arrow, broken arrow, broken arrow. The call went out on all frequencies. The call reached every air control station in South Vietnam. The call meant one thing and one thing only: An American unit was in danger of being overrun. All available aircraft were to respond immediately. Ordnance expenditure limits were waived. Risk considerations were secondary. Get to X-ray. Now, within minutes, the sky above the Ia Drang Valley began to fill with aircraft. They came in layers. F-100 Super Sabres at low altitude, screaming in at 500 miles per hour to deliver napalm strikes within 50 yards of American positions. F-4 Phantoms at medium altitude, dropping snake eye bombs, high drag bombs designed for low altitude delivery. B-57 Canberra bombers higher up, and even higher, barely visible, the contrails of aircraft at 35,000 feet, circling, waiting their turn. Every 1,000 feet of altitude, from 1,000 to 35,000, had aircraft stacked up, a vertical carousel of American air power, all of it focused on one clearing in the Central Highlands. The first napalm strike went wrong. An F-100 came in too low, too fast, and dropped its load of napalm canisters short. The jellied gasoline, which burns at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, fell directly on American positions. Men screamed. Some burned to death. Others were horribly wounded. But the attack continued because there was no other choice. For the next 3 hours, Landing Zone X-ray ceased to be a battlefield in any conventional sense and became something else entirely. It became a demonstration of what happens when American military doctrine, air superiority, overwhelming firepower, and absolute commitment to supporting ground forces is executed without restraint. The tree lines where North Vietnamese soldiers had been massing simply ceased to exist. Entire sections of jungle were replaced by smoking craters. The air was so thick with smoke and dust that pilots had to drop their ordnance based on coordinates alone, unable to visually acquire targets. Artillery from LZ Falcon fired continuously. Colonel Moore would later say of the artillerymen, "The brave cannon cockers in LZ Falcon went without sleep for 3 days and nights to help keep us surrounded by a wall of steel." It wasn't a wall. It was a hurricane. A typhoon of high explosives and burning napalm that consumed everything in its path. By 10:30 a.m., the North Vietnamese assault had broken. Soldiers who had been charging forward were now retreating, pulling their dead and wounded back into what remained of the jungle. The human wave that had threatened to overwhelm Charlie Company had been shattered by a combination of desperate American riflemen and the most concentrated application of air power ever directed at a single battlefield position. Charlie Company held, of the 139 men who had started the day in Charlie Company, 49 were unwounded at the end. There were no officers left, not a single one. The company had been commanded through the worst hours of the battle by sergeants and corporals men who had never expected to command anything larger than a fire team. They had held the line. By late afternoon on November 15th, the situation at X-Ray had stabilized. Alpha Company from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had been flown in during the morning fight, arriving just as the North Vietnamese assault was breaking. Now, with the immediate crisis past, Moore coordinated with higher command to bring in even more troops. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Walter Tully, marched overland from Landing Zone Victor. They arrived on foot, exhausted but ready. And finally, 2nd Platoon Sergeant Savage's cutoff unit could be reached. At 3 p.m. on November 15th, more than 24 hours after they had been surrounded, American forces pushed through to 2nd Platoon's position. What they found was a testament to courage under fire. 8 men dead, 12 wounded, 7 still fighting. They had held a perimeter 30 yards in diameter for an entire day and night, fighting off multiple attacks, never breaking, never surrendering. Savage had kept them alive through meticulous ammunition discipline and sheer force of will. When the relief force arrived, 2nd Platoon still had rounds in their magazines and fight left in them. The perimeter at X-Ray was now consolidated. 3 full battalions were crammed into the clearing. The North Vietnamese still controlled the surrounding terrain, but they had paid a horrific price for every yard of ground. By the count of American soldiers moving through the battlefield, 634 North Vietnamese bodies lay in and around Landing Zone X-Ray. Artillery and airstrikes had killed an estimated 1,215 more. 79 Americans were dead. 121 were wounded. The mathematics of the broken arrow call were stark. For every American killed on November 15th, more than 20 North Vietnamese soldiers died. November 16th, 1965, just before 4 a.m., the North Vietnamese launched 4 separate attacks against Bravo Company of the 2nd Battalion. Each attack was repelled by rifle fire and artillery. The enemy still had fight left in them, but the pattern was clear. The North Vietnamese were launching smaller, more tentative attacks. They had learned what the broken arrow call meant. By 9 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDay's 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry began arriving at X-Ray. The plan was to rotate battalions. McDay's fresh troops would take over the position, while Moore's battered 1st Battalion would be extracted. At 3 p.m., Moore's men boarded Hui's and flew first to Landing Zone Falcon, then onto Camp Holloway near Pleiku. For the soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, the Battle of Ia Drang was over. They had held Landing Zone X-Ray for 3 days against overwhelming odds. They had called in the first broken arrow of the Vietnam War. They had survived something that should have destroyed them. As Moore's helicopters lifted off, B-52 bombers flying from Guam were already en route. The clearing that American soldiers had fought so desperately to hold was about to be obliterated by high-altitude bombing. The ground the Americans had bled for would be pulverized by their own air force, ensuring that no North Vietnamese force could use it as a base of operations. What happened next? The ambush at Landing Zone Albany would cast a shadow over the victory at X-Ray. McDay's battalion, moving cross-country to Albany, was ambushed by the North Vietnamese 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment in what would become the most successful enemy ambush of the entire war. Of 500 men, 150 were killed. But that is a different story. The story of Landing Zone X-Ray, the story of Broken Arrow, is about what happens when outnumbered soldiers refuse to break, and when a single radio call brings the full weight of American military power to bear on a single point of ground. In the weeks following the Battle of Ia Drang, American military analysts studied what had happened at X-Ray with intense interest. The statistics were extraordinary. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry entered the battle with approximately 450 soldiers. They faced an estimated 1,600 North Vietnamese regulars in prepared defensive positions, a nearly 4-to-1 disadvantage. American casualties: 79 killed, 121 wounded. North Vietnamese casualties: 634 confirmed killed by body count, plus an estimated 1,215 killed by artillery and airstrikes. Approximately 1,849 killed. The kill ratio was nearly 25-to-1. In any previous war, that kind of disparity would be attributed to a technological mismatch: machine guns against spears, tanks against cavalry. But at Ia Drang, both sides had modern weapons. Both sides had automatic rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades. The difference was the broken arrow call. The North Vietnamese had planned their ambush perfectly. They had achieved surprise. They had numerical superiority. They had the terrain advantage. For the first several hours of battle, they executed their tactics flawlessly. And then Lieutenant Charlie Hastings called down the thunder. Years after the battle, American veterans of Ia Drang would meet with their North Vietnamese counterparts at reunions and memorial ceremonies. The conversations were always striking for one particular theme. The North Vietnamese soldiers spoke with genuine awe about American air power. Senior Colonel Nguyen Huan, who commanded North Vietnamese forces at Ia Drang, would later write, "We had trained for months to fight American soldiers in close combat. We believed that if we could get close enough, grab the Americans by their belt, we could negate their advantage in artillery and air support. At Ia Drang, we succeeded in closing the distance, and still, the sky fell on us." Another North Vietnamese veteran, speaking at a 1990s reunion, put it more simply: "We were told that Americans were weak, that they relied on technology, that in close combat, we would win. We were very brave, we attacked with everything we had, and then the airplanes came. So many airplanes." The North Vietnamese learned critical lessons at Ia Drang. They learned that American units, even when surrounded and outnumbered, would not surrender. They learned that American fire support was more responsive and more devastating than they had anticipated. And they learned that engaging American forces in daylight in positions where air support could be brought to bear was suicidal. For the rest of the war, North Vietnamese tactics would emphasize night attacks, rapid withdrawal before dawn, and fighting in terrain where air support was difficult to employ, thick jungle, caves, urban areas. Ia Drang taught them respect. Major Bruce Crandall and Captain Ed Freeman became legends for their actions at Ia Drang. For 14 hours, they flew Huis into landing zone X-ray under constant enemy fire, resupplying ammunition and evacuating wounded soldiers. Neither man was required to make those flights after the initial insertions. Their primary mission was complete, but when they saw the situation on the ground, when they heard the radio calls pleading for ammunition and medical evacuation, they made a choice. Crandall will later recall, "It was the longest day I ever experienced in any aircraft. The Hui was the best helicopter ever made. We saved so many more people because of that helicopter." 22 flights into and out of a hot LZ, 70 wounded soldiers evacuated, multiple helicopters damaged so badly they had to be replaced. Crandall and Freeman were both awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions. Crandall in 2007, Freeman in 2001. The delay in recognition didn't diminish the impact of what they had done. In a battle remembered for the broken arrow call and devastating airstrikes, it's worth remembering that the most dangerous flights were the ones made by helicopter pilots who flew through enemy fire to save their fellow soldiers. The air mobile concept that had been questioned and doubted just months before had proven itself in the most extreme tests imaginable. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's meticulous preparation paid dividends that can't be easily quantified. His soldiers were trained, they were disciplined, they understood their mission and trusted their leadership. But Moore's most important contribution to the battle was his understanding of combined arms warfare. He didn't rely exclusively on his riflemen. He didn't try to win the battle through infantry tactics alone. From the first moment of contact, Moore integrated artillery, air support, and ground forces into a seamless system. When 2nd Platoon was cut off, he used artillery to create a protective barrier around them. When Charlie Company was being overrun, he didn't hesitate to call Broken Arrow, even knowing the risks of close air support. After the battle, Moore was asked about his decision to call Broken Arrow. His response was characteristically direct. "We were about to lose Charlie Company. If we lost Charlie Company, the whole perimeter would collapse. The choice wasn't whether to risk close air support. The choice was between close air support and defeat." Moore would go on to become a lieutenant general. His book, We Were Soldiers Once, and Young, co-written with journalist Joseph Galloway, would become the definitive account of the battle. The book was later adapted into the film We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson as Moore. But Moore's legacy isn't just in books and films. It's in the doctrine of the United States military, the principle that American ground forces should never be left unsupported, that overwhelming firepower should be brought to bear without hesitation when American lives are at stake, that preparation and training matter. These principles were tested at Ia Drang and proven. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. features 58,318 names inscribed on black granite panels. Panel 3E contains the names of those killed at the Battle of Ia Drang. Among those names, Lieutenant Henry Herrick, who led 2nd Platoon into the jungle and never came back. Sergeant Lorenzo Nathan, who took over a machine gun position when its crew was killed and held it until he died. Captain Luis Moreno, Platoon Leader Harold Durham, Sergeant Jack Gale, Specialist Willie Godbold. 79 names from Landing Zone X-ray. Another 155 from the ambush at Albany. Veterans of Ia Drang return to the wall regularly. Some leave photographs, others leave letters. Many simply stand quietly, running their fingers over names they remember, faces they can still see. In 1993, veterans from both sides of the battle met for the first time at a reunion in Hanoi. American soldiers who had fought at X-ray sat across tables from North Vietnamese soldiers who had attacked them. They shared stories, they showed photographs, they cried together for the young men on both sides who never came home. One American veteran, looking at his former enemy across the table, said, "We were both soldiers. We both did our duty. The ones who deserve to be remembered are the ones who didn't make it home." A North Vietnamese veteran responded through a translator, "We respect your courage. You fought very hard. We thought we could overwhelm you with numbers. We were wrong." The translator paused, then added something the North Vietnamese soldier had said off the record: "When you called Broken Arrow, we thought the world was ending." The Battle of Ia Drang proved that the air cavalry concept worked. Over the next 7 years of American ground involvement in Vietnam, helicopter-borne operations would become standard. Quick insertion, overwhelming fire support, rapid extraction. The Broken Arrow call itself became a formal part of American military doctrine. The procedures were codified. Training was standardized. And the promise inherent in those two words that no American unit in contact would ever be left unsupported became sacrosanct. That promise has been kept in every conflict since. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American ground forces operated with the absolute certainty that if they were attacked, if they were surrounded, if they were in danger of being overrun, help would come. Close air support, artillery, medevac helicopters, reinforcements. The specifics changed. Hueys gave way to Black Hawks, F-100s gave way to F-16s and A-10s, but the principle remained. American forces don't abandon their own. The kill ratio at Ia Drang set a standard that was matched and exceeded in later battles, but the psychological impact of that first Broken Arrow call can't be overstated. For American soldiers, it meant that their country would bring every available resource to save them. For their enemies, it meant that attacking American units carried catastrophic risk. General Westmoreland, commander of American forces in Vietnam, visited Landing Zone X-ray days after the battle. He stood in the clearing where Charlie Company had held their line and looked at the devastated jungle around him. The trees were shattered. The ground was cratered. Entire sections of terrain had been burned down to bare earth. He reportedly said, "This is what happens when you attack American soldiers." At Fort Benning, Georgia, now Fort Moore, renamed in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, there is a museum dedicated to the history of American military innovation. Among the exhibits is a helicopter, a Bell UH-1 Iroquois, the same model that Bruce Crandall flew at Ia Drang. Next to the helicopter is a radio, the same type Lieutenant Charlie Hastings used to transmit the Broken Arrow call. And on the wall, there's a quote from Hal Moore: "We were outnumbered. We were surrounded. We were exhausted, but we were never defeated." Because when you attack American soldiers, you don't just fight those soldiers. You fight everything America can bring to bear. Every aircraft, every artillery piece, every soldier who can reach you. We called it Broken Arrow. The enemy called it hell. Below the quote is a simple statistic. Kill ratio at LZ X-ray, 25-1. November 14th through 16th, 1965. 3 days. One clearing in the central highlands of South Vietnam. 450 American soldiers against 1,600 North Vietnamese regulars. The mathematics said the Americans should have lost. The mathematics didn't account for Hal Moore's preparation. For the courage of soldiers like Sergeant Ernie Savage, who held a cut-off platoon together for 24 hours. For pilots like Bruce Crandall and Ed Freeman, who flew into hell to save their fellow soldiers. And the mathematics didn't account for 2 words spoken over a radio at 8 a.m. on November 15th, 1965. Broken Arrow. Those 2 words transformed near certain defeat into overwhelming victory. They brought the full weight of American air power down on a single point of ground. They proved that the air cavalry concept worked. They established a doctrine that has saved countless American lives in every conflict since. The Battle of Ia Drang was the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese forces. It set the tone for a war that would last another decade. But more importantly, it established a principle: American forces don't fight alone. When Lieutenant Charlie Hastings transmitted that Broken Arrow call, he didn't just save Charlie Company. He didn't just save the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. He called into being a promise that has echoed through 50 years of American military history. The promise that when American soldiers are in danger, everything will be done to save them. The sky fell on Landing Zone X-ray in November 1965, and it has fallen on America's enemies ever since.